The psychedelic revolution is here. If you want to integrate your visionary experiences into your purpose, get clear on your entrepreneurial path, and help people while you do what you love, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur, Medicine for These Times. I'm your host, Beth Weinstein. I'm a spiritual business coach, 3-time entrepreneur, and a lifelong student of psychedelics and sacred plant medicines. You carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times. This podcast will help you to share your medicine so you can create transformation in the world. Listen in on conversations with psychedelic leaders, changemakers, and conscious entrepreneurs who are living proof that a better world is possible when you follow your heart and live in alignment with your soul. Hey, I just wanted to let you know to sign up for my all-new free online series called Psychedelics, Sacred Medicines, Purpose, and Business. You can sign up now. It's totally free. We start September 29th. It goes until October 8th. And in this series, I bring you over 35 of the world's leading experts and authors and visionaries and entrepreneurs in the fields of psychedelics, sacred plant medicines, animal medicines, entrepreneurship, personal development, astrology, tantra, visionary art, science, health and wellness, human design, and more. Be sure to join in. It's totally free. Psychedelics, Sacred Medicines, Purpose, and Business. You can grab the link here in the show notes, and I will see you there. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur. I'm here with Manesh Girn. Hi, Manesh. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Beth. My pleasure.
So it's really exciting to have you on here. I've heard about your work for a while. You are known as the Psychedelic Scientist, and I personally am very interested in learning more about the science and neuroscience of psychedelics, even though I know a little, and I know our audience will love to hear what's going on with you. So if you haven't heard of Manesh, he is a PhD candidate in neuroscience at McGill University and has been lead or co-author on over a dozen scientific publications and book chapters on topics including psychedelics, meditation, daydreaming, and the default mode network. His PhD dissertation focuses on the default mode network, and he is also conducting research on the brain mechanisms underlying LSD, psilocybin, and DMT in collaboration with Dr. Robert Carhart-Harris and others from the Imperial College London Center for Psychedelic Research. In his free time, he also runs a YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist, where he discusses the latest findings in psychedelic science in an easy-to-understand but non-superficial form. And you can see his links right here in the show notes at The Psychedelic Scientist, Instagram, YouTube, and he's also on Twitter. So Manesh, talk to us a little bit about your path. What brought you to go into your PhD and do your dissertation, all your research around psychedelics? What brought you on to that path in your life?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. So I think my first window into this kind of a thing was perhaps in my mid to late teens, actually, like around 17. And back then, I got introduced to Zen Buddhism, actually, to meditation and Eastern spirituality and these kinds of things. And I just found it fascinating. I found it fascinating, the idea of training and steeling our mind in order to have more insight into the world and change how we perceive it and all this kind of thing. And eventually, my readings took me to the work of Stanislav Grof, who's the pioneering LSD psychiatrist who did thousands of sessions over the 60s and 70s. And he's written like a dozen books at this point. He's in his 80s, still alive. There's recently actually a great documentary about him called The Way of the Psychonaut. But in any case, so I came across his book, and in this book, he was kind of outlining what he calls his cartography of the psyche, and which is his map. Basically, it was a map of different types of experiences people have under high-dose LSD in therapeutic settings. And so this is a fascinating book, and he describes in there how people would reliably have these kind of mystical experiences of oneness with the universe, feeling like they're encountering ultimate reality, and all sorts of things with a positive benefit in their life. And I was like, here I am. I was told my entire life that these drugs make you go crazy and they're hard drugs and should be avoided and there's no value in them. And they're addictive, which is also not true. And so it's fascinating. These seem to be like really potent tools for altering how we perceive the world in a radical way, which is fascinating in itself, but also in a way that can actually help people. And so then I was like, I want to study this and how our mind creates our reality, how we interpret our experiences. And I went down the path of psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience after that, basically.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's interesting how something as simple as Zen Buddhism could lead to this exploration of the mind. For me, it was actually the opposite, where psychedelics came before Buddhism and meditation, but it was all interconnected. I noticed that I got the same feeling running a marathon or running a 10K as I did on psychedelics as I did meditating. Full circle. So tell people a little bit more about what you do as a psychedelic scientist and what inspired you to start putting this work out there.
Right. In terms of my YouTube channel in particular, you're asking, right?
Yeah, YouTube, your work. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, well, I'll start with the YouTube channel. Like, I noticed, obviously we all know psychedelics are blowing up. It's all over the mainstream. There's millions and millions of dollars going into it in the industry. New startups popping up every day. And a lot of people trying to get on the education side of things and spread information about psychedelics. And me looking over this, a lot of it just wasn't very good. People, who seem to have very little kind of understanding of the actual research as it's being conducted and how the papers are written and how findings are phrased and described, are writing all sorts of media articles, which are pretty sensationalistic a lot of the time, hyping up narratives which don't really fit with the data, and running away with stories. And, even Michael Pollan, his book is awesome and it's really popularized this whole space, but he, described a lot of things that people take as truth, but they were just, provisional theories at the time that aren't definitively known or proven. And now people assume, oh, default mode network is going to be turned off and it's going to turn off your ego and stuff like this, which is not necessarily, like, we don't know that that's true. It's likely much more complicated than that. And so anyway, so I saw this kind of space and a lot of people jumping in who didn't really know their stuff. And I was like, I want to contribute to it and I want to provide information that's kind of faithful to the science and the actual papers that people are writing, but that's understandable for the non-specialist. And so I wanted to, help educate people in the space and spread knowledge and awareness in a way that I thought was good, in a way that I would be happy with how it's being described. So that was part of it. And then also I just wanted to share with my friends and family what it is that I'm doing, why I'm studying these drugs, etc. People who don't really know that much about the space.
Yeah, no, and I think this is going to be so necessary as as it keeps growing, the popularity, the mass media. It's interesting because that's what inspired me to start my podcast and my online summits years and years ago was that the media, the mainstream, really, to me, it was only providing one narrative, which I understand. It's like, okay, this is the research and this is what's coming through. But there was so much more to it than that. I was like, well, what about the people who are already healthy, that maybe don't have PTSD, that are working with psychedelics for other reasons, or what about, for me, it was like, the exploration of psychedelics helping people come into their purpose. So that's what inspired me. And I'm glad you're doing this because there is so much information out there. And of course, in our today's day of questionable all news, no one knows what to believe. I'm curious, so I studied psychology and a little bit of neuroscience when I was in college. And originally that was my path that I wanted to go into until I realized I would be in school for a million years. And then I was like, no. But I'm curious, as a scientist, studying this as a PhD candidate, do we know the full spectrum of psychedelics? Like, do we really know what's happening and how they work? Or is this something that's still getting uncovered every day through science and research? Like, do we really understand their potentiality?
The research is in its very, very early stages. We know very little, because it was studied a lot in the 60s and 70s. with the methods and techniques that were available there, which are very different than what's available now. Then there was like 40 years where there was no research, essentially. Now it's only been maybe 10, 15 years of research that's resumed, which is not very long at all, especially given the restrictions and the, difficulties with funding and everything that's still present to a large degree outside of industry. Um, so I think people overestimate how much we know. We know very little. We have models and frameworks that are provisional that seem to kind of make sense, but don't explain all the data, haven't been supported by all the data, and we're really just moving along step by step, which is how science goes. So like I'd say if you had to give a number from 1 to 100 on how much we understand psychedelics, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10, like maybe 10. I don't know, because there's a lot, and the brain is extraordinarily complex. Even if I were to say how much does neuroscience understand the brain, it's probably in the ballpark of 20% or something. If we had to give a number, there's so much we don't know. And so that's why it's so exciting. We're just really at the beginning, and there's so much to be discovered and learned, so many cool studies to be run. That's what makes me super stoked to be a part of this, especially, just starting my career at this perfect time.
It's so incredible that it's such a small percentage. It's just so amazing to see. Even the brain itself is such a mystery still. So I'm curious, you as a scientist, I grew up with a scientist as a father who is, I think always very deeply skeptical of all of this. Including like everything to do with, God, religion, spirituality, and so on. But what's interesting is as, later on in life, I discovered this other part of my dad that I think was really curious about, like the nature of our reality. And I think on some level he knew like what I would know now, right? Like, okay, well, what is this particle that we're all in? Like, what is this energy that we're living in? Like this thing that we call life. I'm curious to know, as a scientist, how did psychedelics shape your views on, what you're doing today? Like, have you had these big experiences that kind of changed everything for you? Or were you always just very open? Or were you ever like, now I'm just going to be like the scientist only and not take any of the other matter into, consideration? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for me, I've always been very open-minded. I was originally, most people go the route you go, they turned on to spirituality and these concepts through psychedelics. But I was already somehow like that as a 16-year-old, reading meditation books for some reason that I found interesting. And so I've always had more of an open-minded view and been inclined towards looking at these kinds of things that people just brush off, but in a more serious way. And whether that's mystical experiences or spirituality or meditation, or even like parapsychology. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that people just say it's nonsense, but there's many people who've been working in that field for decades and doing what they believe to be quality work. So I think, to dismiss these kinds of so-called fringe areas, or people dismiss them as pseudoscience offhand, I think is extremely limiting. We should know better historically how we're just at another historical period with our own limitations and biases and things we're just totally not seeing. And to assume that we know everything and these things are just nonsense, I think is premature. And so I'm very much, open-minded, and my whole thing is trying to bring scientific and kind of, I guess, intellectual rigor to understanding things that are commonly seen as fringe, and seeing, if you look at it in an unbiased way, in a way that fits, people's experiences and the data most reasonably, is there something there? And I think a lot of people, scientists, they claim to be open-minded, but they're not like that. They're very political. They're very attached to their beliefs, especially metaphysical beliefs. And a lot of science is very political. Again, it's a very much like narrative maintenance of the overarching paradigm, and it's hard to deviate because then you're punished by the system in a way by being ostracized or seen as less credible, etc. So it's really a difficult thing. And even me myself, I have to watch, as everyone's scientist, what I say and how I say it, even if I believe it, because some older scientists who have seniority will look down upon it and maybe won't even hire me or something like this. So, it's kind of crazy. But me personally, again, I really want to bring more rigor to these things, and I think it's valuable.
Yeah. And the reality is, hey, who cares if they hire you because you're on your own path. And I think, as you know, my theory, and I know it's kind of this weird line, and I get it. It's, there's politics, there's money, there's funding, there's, we all know how, well, I think most people know how things really work behind the scenes. But the reality is, I think more and more people are opening up to these kind of multidisciplinary ways of seeing the world. Even scientists, like, okay, that maybe they believed one thing and then they had the mystical experience, and maybe now they're opening up to a different idea. And so I do believe in the future, maybe there will be a little more flexibility, and room for alternative discussions, or even what you mentioned, like paranormal activity or paranormal, or, like these unexplainable mystical experiences. I think the more science is kind of studying these and exploring these, the conversation has to shift. It can't just be from this one narrative path of like, oh no, that's only explained by this. It's like, well, maybe there's some things that are truly not explainable. So I'm curious, you're studying LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. These are big ones. And especially DMT, that has been an interesting one for me, where I've only worked with it a few times. I don't, like pure DMT, not ayahuasca, which I've worked with many, many times. But it's a very powerful substance, and there's definitely experiences I've had on it that kind of blew me away, where it blew me away so long that it took like a year and a half to integrate a 10-minute experience. From a scientific point of view, can you explain like what's really happening there? Like, why is it that the way I would describe it, as many others do, is like, well, I died, I saw God, and then I was reborn again. I mean, that's a pretty big thing to say. So that's the way I summarize my experience. But how can we explain this? Or can you explain this from a scientific standpoint on like what's actually happening and why some of these experiences are so intensely powerful like that? Like, that's a big thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the short answer is we have no clue. We don't know. But I could say my own perspective or what I think. I mean, for example, with DMT, in terms of the brain, its effects are very similar to psilocybin and LSD, except much stronger, which makes sense because, like, well, for one, most brain scans of people on LSD or psilocybin aren't necessarily at the total peak of the experience. Whereas with DMT, it is, because the whole experience is a peak experience for them, except for when you're trailing off at the end, or like the 30-second come up or whatever it is. So brain scanners, when we put people, they actually do intravenous, so they're injecting them with DMT, and it's very strong effect on the brain, but similar to LSD and psilocybin. But that said, how that effect on the brain leads to these kinds of experiences that people interpret as, seeing God or merging with the universe, etc. We don't really know. One idea is that it kind of alters brain activity in such a way that, as psychedelics do, makes it more integrated, more complex and dynamic. So you're entering all sorts of brain states you're not usually entering into. And you basically, the processes in your brain that underpin your usual stable way of perceiving reality are kind of overturned or overwhelmed or overwritten temporarily. So then all of the familiar structures we have, I'm a person in a body in space and time, etc., can just start going out the window. And then your mind is like racing. It's like, wait, so what does this mean? What is this, what is the meaning of this? And that might trigger another emotional response where you're just like in shock and in awe. And then for some reason, humans tend to associate that with a sense of sacredness and a kind of expansiveness. And then you bring in the whole interpretation. Oh, this must be God. This must be it. This is it. I understand it all now, And it's just like, I think it's a sequence of events happening, which have their basis in you just having your whole edifice of beliefs and frameworks for understanding reality kind of pulled out from under you. That's kind of how I see it.
Wow. Yeah, I've never really given that very deep thought.
Yeah.
But it makes complete sense what you say is that it's, the initial, especially with something as powerful as DMT, where it's like just so much, so strong all at once, and it's not like it doesn't really ease you into it much. It definitely was one of these experiences where it's like, okay, that is nothing at all like reality. At least with psilocybin, there's always this kind of sense of reality, even on a very big dose. Like I can still navigate our real world and understand like, oh, okay, I'm here, in this house, or I can feel my body still, even if it feels distorted. But my first powerful DMT experience was with 5-MeO-DMT with the Sonoran Desert Toad, the Bufo, and I completely whited out, like, which I'm sure you've heard of or even experienced, where it's like I was gone completely and then I came back. And being gone completely was it was a very strange feeling because I was not consciously aware of what was actually happening until I started coming back. And then, of course, the mind is like, what the hell's happening? The one thing I've always wondered, and I've asked people about this, not from scientific standpoint, but maybe this is the same explanation you just gave, is I felt that it had, over a period of a few years after doing this one experience, I felt that certain things in my being had just cleared away. And when I say my being, they were things that are, and this is where we get pretty deep and philosophical because some people don't even believe in this, but, ancestral experiences, past life experiences, karma, as we would maybe call it, just for lack of a better word, or even like collective, like clearing something in like the collective space. Do you believe that something like these medicines, like DMT or Toad or, any of the medicines really have this ability to get into our DNA and like it felt like there was kind of a pulling away of material, whatever we want to call that material, energies, traumas, experiences, sankharas. It felt like it was pulled away off of my cells, my DNA, and then it just like never came back. Do you think there's an explanation for this?
I mean, there must be, right? Because like the experiences you're describing are very commonly reported, right? Even Groff in the books I mentioned, even his 1975 book, he's like hundreds of people, had these experiences of past life regression or experiencing, the collective memories and collective emotions or their ancestors, or he even described far out stuff of people, experiencing the consciousness of a lizard, etc. So like this crazy stuff that doesn't make any sense from our, standpoint on things. And so I think, as a scientist, well, one, we have to acknowledge like, yes, these experiences happen to people. They're not just making this up. These are real phenomenological subjective experiences they're having. And then it's like, but what do they mean? And that's where the question is. It's like, is this somehow tapping into our brain's imaginative potential or like the processes that operate when we're dreaming? Or are we somehow, our consciousness is touching something that's beyond our brain, beyond our mind, beyond our individualized consciousness? And at the end of the day, we can't know which one it is. It's just a matter of what framework or story we want to use to interpret these experiences, right? And I think the interesting thing is that these experiences are healing, as you said. You're not just having some cool vision and then you're back, but it's like these are often like very heavy and emotional, and have some relationship to yourself or your family line or whatever, and are healing, right? And then it's like, what does it mean to heal collective trauma? What does it mean to heal ancestor trauma? And as you're saying, maybe to some extent it's epigenetic. You're changing certain epigenetic modifications that were passed on in your genes, and people have written about that in relation to ayahuasca particularly. Or maybe we just really don't know much about the psyche, about the mind, and how deep it goes. Obviously, if you read Carl Jung's work, it goes way deeper than just the individual psyche, and there's a lot of stuff going on down there, which we seem to be able to access with psychedelics on a fairly reliable basis. So it always just, yeah, there's just so many levels to it, and we can't really, uh, it gets very difficult if we start asking what's real or not, or what's really going on. But I think what's more important is this helping people? Is this helping
Mhm.
you become more whole within yourself and live a happier life? I think that's, as researchers, what we focus on, and leave the rest to mystics and philosophers and stuff, right? And ideally,
Mhm.
the best neuroscientist or scientist is also a mystic and philosopher. That's how we should all try to be, but it's often not the case. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's true. It's like the human mind, or at least my mind, wants to make sense out of everything. It's I spent probably 2 years after that first experience questioning like what the hell just happened. And I had done all the other things. Like I one of my most powerful experiences in my life was a 10-day Vipassana, right? Like meditation every day, hours and hours and hours.
Mm.
And it was almost as powerful, but nothing had been that quick and that strong and that intense and also so deeply healing. And yeah, maybe it actually doesn't matter right now. And we all just want to make sense out of everything to understand it and put explanation to it. But, in the end, why not just focus on like, hey, it helped, it did something, my life shifted, who knows what it was from. It's all good. But let's get into the research that you're up to. It's interesting. I actually met Amanda Fielding from the Beckley Foundation back in, God, what was it, 2015? Actually, long story, at her castle out in Oxford. And I remember, my path has been mostly with plant medicines. Yes, my first psychedelic experience was 14 years old with LSD, but plants are more my thing. But I remember her talking about the future of LSD and all this research that was happening around the brain and potential for curing Alzheimer's, which my own stepfather has died of just 2 years ago. I'm curious, and I remember being like, wow, is there a chance that something like LSD will lead to the cure for Alzheimer's? And that was kind of my first foray into really understanding the level of research that was happening in these universities. But let's hear more about the research that you're up to. What is it that your focus is, and what is actually happening out there on the front lines in the universities, in the academics? I hope that it's gone just beyond just PTSD and
Yeah, yeah,
the
totally.
ones that we've been hearing about for a few years. Not to
Yeah,
diminish PTSD. Of course, we all have PTSD, but I'm curious what's like happening now and in the future in the research realm.
totally. I mean, there's a lot. So if you went back 5 years, you can probably know all the main people doing psychedelic research, and you can keep up with the research literature as it comes out. But these days, there's just like so much being done across North America and Europe and Australia, etc. And so there's just so much work going on. A lot of it is clinical, so it's looking at psilocybin or LSD and DMT, and some research on 5-MeO as well. How it can treat different disorders, right? So what you're referring to is probably MDMA for PTSD. That's been the main focus of MAPS, for example, for a long time. But I think there's a lot more steam growing with psilocybin these days too for depression, as well as for tobacco addiction, alcoholism, anorexia, and like eating disorders. And I'm sure there's other ones too. There's a lot of studies coming out for a variety of different indications because they seem to be effective in this very what we would call trans-diagnostic way. So across many diagnoses, which usually we see as distinct, but seem to be able to be tackled with psychedelic therapy. And so there's a lot of clinical research. And then what I find most interesting and fun is like the neuroscience and kind of cognitive psychology type studies. So it's like, how does it affect the brain? How does it affect different aspects of our thinking, emotion, and behavior? And I think those are really interesting. And we're really at the tip of the iceberg on that too. Stuff finding that, LSD boosts empathy and pro-social behavior, how these drugs affect creativity, how they can be used to enhance memory recall or change different aspects of memory, and how they affect our attention and our ability to do focused kind of tasks. All this kind of stuff is coming out, and it's very important to explore. How do they actually affect our thinking on a in terms of a practical sense, instead of because we understand that psychedelics affect our experience, But of course, we haven't even begun to fully explore what that really is scientifically. But then, how does it affect our ability to do things? And does it help, and what does it impair? And so I think that's really interesting too. And I think sooner or later, and this is something I want to spearhead in the future as well, is kind of using psychedelics as a tool for personal growth and transformation. And of course, there's a huge, huge underground world doing this, but not in the scientific community necessarily yet, only indirectly in a number of ways. So I think, stuff like combining psychedelic use with visualization, to change behavior, change self-image, this kind of stuff. Using it for creativity in different contexts, not just like boring lab tasks, which are pretty meaningless in the end of the day. And seeing can they actually be used to help healthy people live more meaningful, rich, healthy, whole, lives. In addition to all the work with people who are suffering from conditions. Because I think both are important, I'm sure you would agree. So I think all these things are just, again, very early. So there's so much stuff happening, and it's all can be blowing up in the next 5 to 10 years. That's for sure.
Yeah, and this is thank you so much for sharing. This is what my interest was, where I was inspired 3 years ago or whatever it's been now, 4 years ago, to start talking about the intersection of psychedelics and plant medicines to help us come into our purpose and find meaning and do work that we love. Because, I've been a business coach for many years, and I help people start businesses, and a lot of my clients come from careers that they found very unfulfilling. And to me, this was my own journey as well, where I had the typical like corporate career, and it was okay. I didn't despise it, but I knew it wasn't really me. It wasn't living my truth, and I knew I was here for something else. And what I've seen over the years is kind of this, especially here in America, I never really speak for other countries, but it's a big thing to be raised and taught, like, okay, the goal is to go to college, get a job, work at a job that pays you well, suck it up, and then you die. And that's kind of the narrative of like, okay, you just got to survive, get a good job that pays well. But there's so many people that were, really stuck doing things that didn't make them happy and didn't fulfill them and made them miserable, which then maybe was what caused the depression, what caused the anxiety, what caused the alcoholism or the addictions or the addictive the addictive actions that they were taking. And so what I find really interesting is there's been a lot of discussion around like, oh, these psychedelics help heal your depression. But then it's like, well, wait a second, what's at the root of the depression in our society? Yes, right. I know COVID has sparked a whole lot of isolation. But really for me, my own depression and anxiety that was far in the past by now was really caused by being in a career I hated, not enjoying anything about it, not seeing any meaning and purpose in life, which then kind of brought me to the place of like, well, I'll just drink a bottle of wine, or I'll go numb myself with these addictive activities, which is kind of the downward spiral. And so I'm curious what your take is on, you have this interest in psychedelics for personal development, which people like me and a lot of my clients and a lot of my friends and community are on that path. But do you see this becoming, more of an interest in things like working with psychedelics to find purpose, or to like rethink how we do business, or even rethink our entire systems? Has this come up in the scientific community or the communities that you're a part of?
Not necessarily. There's talk of it, but there's very little research, like hard research on it. People do acknowledge that there's, very likely something there, and there is something there. And often in the humanities, they discuss this more, but in the scientific space, not as much. But I think, as we move forward and psychedelic science and psychedelic research in general expands, it's going to start to bleed more into other more mainstream disciplines and fields of work, right? And so I think even though, not necessarily everyone's going to take psychedelics in the corporate world, et cetera, but I think the insights that are coming up for people and for researchers and, in the science in general are going to help other people gain insight into themselves and how they might be able to behave differently or think differently or pursue some kind of growth or change in who they are. Because I think at the end of the day, as you're saying, not everything can just be cured by taking a drug in this kind of a context. You can't just take a psychedelic and heal some of your trauma and work through some things, and then you're back and you're fine. It's like, what community are you a part of? What kind of life situation are you in? Is it something? Are you in alignment with yourself? And for somebody, let's say they go into an experience and have a beautiful, profound experience, realize their entire career path was a response of trauma to please their dad, or whatever their story is, and they come out of it and they're like, I don't want to do this anymore. And everyone's like, no, you're going to continue to do it because that's who you are, or and their life doesn't set them up to make the choices they want to make, and now they know they really need to make. They can just go into a deeper depression after that, right? So I think a lot of these, community-based and systemic things should be really tackled as well. But that said, I think enough people having a psychedelic experience and seeing through their life in a sense and seeing what's better for them will create energy towards making healthier lifestyles. And as more people do that and know people who are doing that, I think then it'll spread slowly, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's my hope, and I think we're seeing this happen. We will see what happens because it's a Wild West and a very fast changing world that we're living in. But I do believe that generally these are here for a positive reason. And there's a reason why they've grown so much in popularity. And hopefully the only way is up. So tell me, what specifically is your area of current study? And then what do you see yourself doing in the future with your PhD and your research and your path? Like if you care to talk about it, I don't know. It's up to you.
For sure. Yeah. So right now I'm here in Montreal, and actually in Montreal and McGill, there's no human psychedelic research happening here right now in terms of collecting data. I'm in talks with a bunch of professors, etc. We're going to get it off the ground the next year or two for sure, but it's not here yet. So what I've been doing is collaborating with other labs who already have data of people on psychedelics. So the stuff I was talking about before, the brain imaging data with LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, I got through collaborations with Robin Carhart-Harris and Leo Roseman, Chris Timmerman, and others at Imperial College Center for Psychedelic Research. So I managed to get myself into their network and collaborate on some projects with them. So for that, I am looking at how different networks in our brain are altered and change their shape, in a sense, under psychedelics. So that's one of them that I'm looking at. And then also just doing some of the first actually comparisons, looking at the three different drugs and what overlaps between them. Because so far, LSD and psilocybin have been published separately mostly. DMT hasn't been published yet, but it should be in the next 6 months or so. I know Chris is working on that from ICL, Imperial College. And so I'm doing some larger comparison studies looking at a bunch of stuff that's been already collected to look at consistencies. So that's like the psychedelics aspect of my research. And I'm also, my actual research that I'm doing here physically is on the DeFi network and how it relates to, which is a network in our brain that's involved in a lot of interesting aspects of our thinking. So I'm characterizing how it relates to certain cognitive processes, you could say, very generally. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. And in 2 years, I'm done my PhD. And 99% chance I'm going to be joining Robin Carhart-Harris, who's now at UCSF, so University of California, San Francisco. So I'll very join him for a postdoctoral fellowship, as it's called, and work there for 2 to 4, maybe more years, just doing more research. And then I really want to get into research on how psychedelics can enhance the lives of healthy people and, facilitate belief change, behavior change, how it relates to things like cognitive and psychological flexibility and creativity, and how we can even start to collaborate with some others and perhaps in the Bay Area and beyond, doing more alternative type things and how to bring those into the scene as well. So that's kind of my plan.
This is so cool. I'm like, I have so much hope for the future when I hear all this, because I know the work of Dr. Carhart-Harris is very cutting edge, and he's been out there in the world. And I know actually a friend of mine just told me about an app that he's working on, or I think he's involved in. And it's just so interesting because this is the future, and there's so much potential with the research you're doing. Even what you just said, that we haven't really compared psilocybin with LSD and DMT, and you're right. It's like there's so many similarities in the felt experience, but none of us out there really understand this and how they work and what's really happening. So it will be very interesting to see what comes about, especially if you're in the Bay Area with a lot of people who are interested, who have a lot of influence and money. And hopefully, and I'm curious what your take is on this, because I just had this discussion with someone the other day about how these medicines might help us to actually solve a lot of the larger scale problems that we face as a planet. You know, there's climate change, there's a pandemic still going on, there's how do we get, our systems into balance? How do we solve, the inequalities in the world? Do you feel that there's a potentiality besides, like, I know your interest is in like personal growth and, maybe in like understanding how we create our realities and how we can live more meaningful, happier lives. But, I've always been curious about what the potential is for psychedelics to literally like fix our problems as a global, like a planet. Do you think that's in the works? Like, do you know anyone who's kind of doing this work behind the scenes, or is this maybe a potential, or am I just like very wishful thinking right now?
Right. I mean, we have to be careful to not overstate, I guess, here.
Yeah.
I mean, because psychedelics have huge potential in showing people different aspects of themselves, giving them an opportunity to change, and providing new insight, and perspective on the world and themselves. But they won't just magically, make you into an amazing person who's going to change the world. So I think at the end of the day, psychedelics are part of a broader set of, we could say, holistic interventions and practices that can help people live from a healthier, more whole and aware, you could say, state or place. And that these people will be drivers of healthier ways of living and living in harmony with the environment and not succumbing to kind of excessive egocentric desires and consumption and, me above everybody and everything else. So I think psychedelics can be an important piece within a whole set of things in that context, which can lead people in the direction that we presumably would want to go. But I am very reluctant to say that psychedelics can change the world and do this and that, because the world is very complex. So it needs a lot of things. So I think how I see it, psychedelics are just another important tool in the broader set of interventions, including diet, including meditation and mindfulness, including embodiment kind of stuff, including psychotherapy, including a variety of things that are sprouting up everywhere. I don't think it's necessarily the only, or it's going to do a lot by itself, I guess.
Yeah, no, that is true. We can't just jump to these big conclusions, but hey, if it helps one person at a time make different decisions, like you said, it's like how we spend our money, how do we live in harmony with the earth and our bodies, within ourselves, eat better, make better decisions. If each person changed and started within, then maybe we could create larger scale transformation on the planet. Before we go, I had one more question that came up. It's interesting. I've done a lot of interviews the last few weeks for my summit, for my podcast. And as someone myself who has studied a fair amount of the brain, but not as much as you, of course, the default mode network has actually come up in conversation numerous times recently. Is this something, a lot of people now know about polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve and understanding our nervous systems more than we used to know? Is this going to come up more and more in conversation? Like, is this maybe part of the work you're doing, is to explain to the common person a little bit more about like, what is the default mode network and why should we care and why should we know about it? Mm-hmm. And, is there a simple way of putting it so that the listeners can understand like how to understand better what's going on in the brain?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to share that because I think, in terms of my own research and probably the future of my career, I would say psychedelics are my number one thing and default mode network in particular is my number two thing. So I'm very much, interested in learning more about the default mode network. And so, yeah, I think the default mode network is becoming more and more in the mainstream. It is almost like the polyvagal theory or stuff like, left brain, right brain, which is not true, by the way. It's been widely debunked. Just like the triune brain theory, which is also debunked, but that's
I've heard
for
that.
it's for another time. But the default mode network is a real thing. It's in our brain, but I think people almost always completely oversimplify what it is or what it does. And so, very generally speaking, the default mode network is a set of regions in our brain which seem to consistently activate together, you could say. They work together very often. That's why we call them a separate network from the rest of the brain. And these regions are involved in a whole variety of aspects of our thinking and our behavior, even our perception. So they're involved in whenever we daydream, or mind wander, or escape the present. When we imagine the future, remember the past, whenever we think about ourselves or identify with something. I say this is me and this is not me. That kind of thing is in the default mode network as well. But also when we watch a movie or interpret a podcast or engage in abstract conceptual thinking, that's the default mode network too. And when you look outside and you see a car and you recognize it's a Mercedes and you recognize the logo as being a Mercedes, probably is tapping in the default mode network too. And so it's really a lot of processes which depend on our memory, and more specifically, where we need to rely on information that's not present in our environment at that time. Whenever that's the case, some part of the default mode network comes online. And what's interesting about the default mode network is that the regions that comprise it are some of the most interconnected in the brain. So they have the most influence, and they also integrate the most amount of information. So they're kind of so-called integrative hubs in the network of the brain. And this is why they're so interesting, because they're so involved in so many complex processes. They mediate a lot of information flow in the brain. The main receptor that psychedelics hit overlap with the default mode network as well. And so it's this fascinating network that's involved in all these things, but it's not equivalent to our ego, as a lot of people say. What we call our ego is probably and very likely related to multiple different brain networks, including what's called the salience network, maybe even the somatomotor network. And what's also important is the default mode network is always in interaction with the rest of the brain and a variety of other networks. And another thing I should say, you can't turn it off. That doesn't make any sense to turn it off. You can reduce its activity, but usually any change in activity is in the order of 10% or something like that. So it's always active, doing stuff. And I can go on, but it's very complex, and even how psychedelics alter it is not very clear. Some studies show it reduces activity and connectivity. Some don't really show that. Some show a correlation with ego dissolution, which is what people talk about. Some don't. So it's very complicated, and we need much more research, especially on the psychedelics and default mode network front.
Okay, I could do like a 2-hour podcast just listening to you talk about this. I'm so glad you're putting out YouTube videos, because I'm kind of a science nerd, even though that has not been my career. I have a tattoo of an atom on my shoulder, and I find this very interesting because I feel like when we work with psychedelics, like it feels like, oh yeah, scientists could easily study this. It totally makes sense, but then the reality is it's all so complex. Mm-hmm. And we're still, babies learning ourselves, learning and understanding the brain. And that is fascinating. And it's so interesting. This has come up in conversations so many times recently, because people are more and more interested in understanding how they work, like what is making us tick. It's not just about go do a psychedelic experience and have some pretty visuals, but really like to understand, this integration, and to understand how, not only how is it working and what's happening, but then how to bring it back into our lives. So I'm really glad I brought you on to talk about all the science behind this and to be on the front lines of what's happening out there in the field. This work is so powerful, and I know there are so many people like me that really appreciate you and all the other neuroscientists that are out there studying this, because that's who's been pushing, this initiative into the mainstream. Regardless of the books and the mainstream media, we need the scientific research to really, back up the mystical woo-woo people like me who are out there saying like, oh, this just makes your life, align with your purpose. we need the science behind this to really get the funding, change the laws, and hopefully decriminalize it so we can go deeper into this exploration of our consciousness. So, Manesh, tell people a little bit more about where they can find you, how they can stay in touch, what you have coming up.
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned at the beginning, I have my Instagram page, The Psychedelic Scientist, also my YouTube channel called the same thing, on which both of them I'm hoping to start posting very regularly and adding a bunch more videos. I have a lot of stuff lined up, so stay tuned for those. For me personally and my research and stuff, Twitter is the best way. So my personal Twitter is mgirnneuro. That's my handle. It's MGIRN. Neuro, so MGirnneuro. And on there, that's where I'll be tweeting any research that comes out from me, etc. And yeah, there'll be a lot of that over the next year. So keep up with that too.
Yes, and best of luck with you. Hopefully this all works out and you go out to San Francisco and we'll see amazing work, and we'll have to bring you back on as more develops, hopefully very fast. And I'm sure it will, since everything seems to be moving so fast out there in the world. So Manesh, It was an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world. And everybody, be sure to join us. I currently have the Psychedelic Sacred Medicines Purpose and Business Series. It is free. It's available now. You can sign up right here in the show notes, and be sure to follow Manesh and all of his work right here at the links in the show notes. And we'll see you next week for another episode. Bye. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're feeling inspired, I'd appreciate it if you showed your love with a review. And check out my YouTube channel where you can find the video version of this podcast. You can also head to bethaweinstein.com to learn more about me and grab my free business growth trainings. Remember, you carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times.